What follows is a brief construction montage.
Late again.
Limited time only.
Flashback.
While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up.
End of flashback. Soon after. Montage.
Previously.
Yesterday. Meanwhile. At the Krusty Krab. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands.
Meanwhile, at the palace of King Poseidon, ruler of the seven seas.
A few moments later.
Moments later.
Many moments later. Many moments later.
Many unbearable moments later.
More moments later.
A little later.
A little later.
A little while later.
Later.
Later. Later. Later. Later.
Later.
Later.
Later.
In the void.
Later still.
Later that evening. Happy friendiversary.
Later that same evening.
Later that day. Later that night.
Later that night.
Later that night.
More later.
Much later.
Much later.
Much later.
Much later.
Much later.
Much later.
Not much later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
The following Thursday.
You get the idea.
Just then, by sheer coincidence, 12 o'clock midnight, 3:28 a.m., 7:59 a.m.,
4 o'clock in the afternoon.
8:01 p.m.,
1 nanosecond later.
10 seconds later, 12 seconds later,
12 seconds later.
13 seconds later.
47 seconds later. 47 seconds later. A few seconds later. A few seconds later.
1 minute later. 1 minute later.
1 minute, 37 seconds later,
2 very boring minutes later.
5 minutes later, 5 minutes later,
5 minutes later. 10 minutes later.
11 minutes later,
15 minutes later.
15 minutes later.
20 minutes later,
A few minutes later.
a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later,
Many minutes later.
1 hour later, 1 hour later,
1 hour later.
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 1 hour later. 1 hour later.
80 minutes later.
2 hours later, 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 2 hours later,
2 hours later. 2 hours later.
3 hours later,
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
3 hours later, 3 hours later,
3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later.
5 hours later, 346 minutes later, 6 hours later, 6 hours later, 6.5 hours later, 7 hours later, 8 hours later, 8 hours later,
9 hours later.
10 hours later, approximately 10 hours later,
12 sleepless hours later.
A few hours later.
several song-filled hours later, many hours later,
Many hours later.
many hours of fun time later,
Many adorable hours later.
Many boring hours of cleaning later.
Many chilly hours later. Many unbearable hours later.
tomorrow for sure. 24 hours later, 24 hours later, early the next morning,
Stupid early the next morning.
the next morning,
The next morning.
the next morning, the next morning,
The next morning.
The next morning.
The next The next morning. 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 Like every morning.
The next day.
The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day in a parallel universe. The very next day.
The following day. Tomorrow.
The very next evening. The next evening. The next Christmas. One day later. One full day of fatherly fun later.
Day 2. 48 hours later. 2 days later. Day 3. 72 hours later. 3 days later.
3 days later.
3 days later.
3 days later.
Day 4.
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later.
Several days later.
Several days later. Several days later. Several long days later. Many disorderly days later.
1 week later. 1 week later.
1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 smelly week later. 1 soggy week later. 1 weekend of pampering later.
2 weeks later.
2 weeks later.
16 paranoia-filled days later.
3 weeks later.
3 weeks later.
4 to 6 weeks later. Several weeks later.
6 months later.
6 months later.
6 months later!
7 months later.
Several months later. Many months later.
70 years later.
75 years later. 2,000 years later. 3,000 years later.
5 million years later.
1 entree later. An eternity later.
1 eternity later.
Opening night. A couple of hours later.
A lot of boring math later.
A lot of wallpapers later.
Very boring walk later.
Many frame building attempts later. Many heartfelt traditions later. Many attempts to fix the past later. Many meeps later. Many meeps later. Many memories later. Many plays later. Many superstitions later. Many tic-tacs later.
Many secret parties later.
Many versions later. Many painful holes later. Many toys later. Many forks later. 1 humongous meal later. 1 semester later. 1 season later. 8 semesters later.
1 debt to society later.
1 very long digestive tract later. 1 loading screen later. 1 loading screen later. 1 little boost to the surface later.
1 pathetic sob story later.
1 frozen wasteland later.
1 long angry line later.
1 beautiful Christmas morning later. 1 movie later.
1 shift later.
1 shift later.
1 extremely annoying shift later. 1 winner later.
1 nap later. 1 operation later.
1 pair of pants later.
1 scary rot later.
1 million zillion jillion dillion cotillion times later. 2 idiots later.
3 annoying songs later.
82 kilometers later.
242 explosions later.
298 frozen patties later. Thousands of tears later.
3,000 whoop-whoos later.
5,000 celebrities later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
A few inches later. Eventually. Several bad puns later.
Several bouquets later. Even more boat building attempts later. Graduation day.
What if SpongeBob was gone? What if SpongeBob was gone?
What if SpongeBob was gone? What if SpongeBob was gone?
Epilogue. Epilogue.
Game over!
I don't believe in magic! I don't believe in magic! I don't believe in magic! Oh,
The end.
Let me at him, Pop! Let me at him! Let me at him! Let me...
I don't get it.
The end.
This is a family show.
The end is so itchy.
Manny, 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 blowing up the whole earth for shame.
Prison!
Yes, hello? I'll take your heaviest object.
Try jiggling the antenna. Oh, I can see my house from here!
Time! Everybody say Merry Christmas!
Today's show went in all sorts of different directions. I hope you all enjoyed it.
It sure is good to be back. Hey, PA! I'll have the usual.
Mud espresso coming right up.
And so ends another exciting episode of The Patrick Star Show. The end.
Not responsible for shattered teeth. The end is correct! We have a winner!
We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.